Good afternoon. My name is Afton Thomas, Associate Director for Programs with the Center for the Study of Southern Culture. On behalf of the center, I would like to thank you all for attending today's SouthTalk. If you attend many of these, you often hear me say the center loves to partner on events. So thank you to the Mississippi Humanities Council and the University of Mississippi's Department of Sociology and Anthropology for co-sponsoring today's event. Our talks typically last 1 hour and we wrap promptly at 1 p.m. Today's event will wrap around 1:15 to allow for good discussion after the presentation. If you need to hop off at 1 o'clock, please do so. We definitely understand. Now I want to introduce you to today's facilitator. James M. Thomas, who goes by JT, is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Mississippi. To date, he is the author or co-author of 4 book-length monographs and over 20 peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, and invited essays on the causes and consequences of race and racism in America and abroad, from comparative and historical analyses of the medicalization of racism in Western Europe and in the United States, to theorizing the complex interplay between race, citizenship, and affect along the US-Mexico border, to critical investigations of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives on college campuses. Thank you, JT, for your time today, and we look forward to a great discussion.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It is my very, very high honor and pleasure to introduce you to a true rock star within the field of sociology. Dr. Margaret Hagerman is an associate professor of sociology at Mississippi State University with faculty affiliations in the African American Studies and Gender Studies programs. Dr. Hagerman has a national reputation for their scholarship, which is situated at the intersections of race, education, and youth studies. Dr. Hagerman's book, White Kids, Growing Up with Privilege in a Racially Divided America, was published in 2019 by New York University Press. With its clear ethnographic description, rich interviews, sharp analysis, and engaging prose, Dr. Hagerman's book has won critical acclaim both in the discipline and among broader public audiences. White Kids was the winner of the 2019 William J. Goode Book Award, given by the Family section of the American Sociological Association for the best book on the sociology of the family. White Kids was also a finalist for the 2019 C. Wright Mills Book Award, given by the Society for the Study of Social Problems, which is among the most prestigious awards in the entire field of sociology. Along with this praise within academic circles, Dr. Hagerman's scholarship has been featured in such popular outlets like Inside Higher Ed Magazine, The Atlantic Magazine, the LA Review of Books, the New York Times, Harper's Bazaar, the Washington Post, and the Boston Review, among many, many others. Dr. Hagerman models what it means to be a public scholar. Along with their public writing, Dr. Hagerman has visited a number of schools, organizations, and communities across the nation to share their knowledge and expertise with parents, teachers, neighborhood associations, school administrators, and young people themselves who remain the passion and focus of Dr. Hagerman's efforts. We are so very fortunate to get to learn from Dr. Hagerman today, and so it is with great excitement that I welcome you, Dr. Hagerman, to our campus community.
Well, wow, thank you so much, JT, for those really kind words. I am just really, yeah, thank you. That means a lot coming, especially from you. And I'd like to just thank Afton Thomas and JT, as well as Katie McKee, the Center for the Study of Southern Culture, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, as well as the Mississippi Humanities Council for hosting me today. I wish that I could be with you all in person, but obviously that is not happening. So let me go ahead and share my screen here, and I will get started. Okay, so Today I'm going to be talking about my book, which JT just mentioned, White Kids Growing Up with Privilege in a Racially Divided America. There's a lot that's happening in this book, so today I'm going to try to just walk you through some of the main findings, and hopefully I can answer any questions afterwards about anything that you would like to know more about. So I'd like to start by just sort of situating myself. So as a sociologist, I'm really interested in understanding how racial inequality and racism in America are socially reproduced over time. And I'm really interested in how that happens from one generation to the next. So certainly this is a question that many scholars have asked, and sociologists have studied broadly the institutional and structural drivers of racial inequality. But we also know that there is this dialectical, mutually supporting relationship between structure and ideology, and that ideology is part of this racialized social system. And the question that I'm really interested in is, how are the ideas that uphold a fundamentally racist system socially reproduced? And so as I have on the slide here, and as Eduardo Bonilla Silva writes, the racially based frameworks used by actors to explain and justify the racial status quo are what we think of in sociology as racial ideology. And so I'm really interested in not only what these stories are, but how they're learned in the first place by the newest members of our society. And in particular, I am super interested in how people who are situated at the top of the racial hierarchy, that is white children, learn these ideas, or how they experience what Du Bois called the public and psychological wages of whiteness, or what we today might call white privilege. So as one of my mentors, Tyrone Foreman, writes, clearly our efforts to eradicate racial and ethnic inequality will not be successful until we better understand the precise mechanisms that reproduce them. And so I argue that we cannot fully understand how racial inequality is reproduced without considering processes of white racial socialization. And so in order to talk about white racial socialization, it's important, I think, to look really quickly at a large body of literature coming out of the field of social psychology, as well as the sociology of race, but also really child development as well. And so what we know is that people's ideas about race form in childhood. And although we have lots of theories about that, we have less empirical evidence about how that actually works. Like, how does it actually, how do people actually come to understand race and racism and develop these ideas? And so what we know is that there's a largely this unexplained set of assertions, which is what I'm hoping to explore. We also know that a lot of the research on how white people develop racial attitudes generally focuses on adults and college students. And there's really awesome research that I draw on in my own work about this, but there's less about children and sort of, what happens in early childhood, middle childhood, and even into early adolescence. Most of what we know about white childhood, in fact, comes from what we call retrospective accounts of white childhood. So asking white adults to reflect back on what they remember from when they were growing up. And again, while this work is very useful, it's still not getting at how children are actually thinking about race and racism in the moment as they experience childhood. And so one of the things that I think is really important to remember here is that, or to understand here, is that the work of studying racial and ethnic socialization comes out of, as I mentioned earlier, the sort of realm of child development. That's really where a lot of this work is happening in human development and family studies. And so a lot of scholars in that area sort of think of this process as really centered on parents. And so this idea of parents' race-related communications to their children. So that's a really sort of standard definition of racial and ethnic socialization. It's also really important to understand that this work comes out of the really intense and hard work and efforts of specifically Black scholars within the field of trying to carve out room for there to be studies of how families of color, and specifically Black families, are preparing kids, or I should say parents who are raising Black children, who how are they preparing kids for encountering racism? And so a lot of this work is about identity development and how families are preparing their kids. And I want to just say that it's really important, I think, to just note we're at the history of this field, because I think that we can build from that, but it's important to acknowledge. So this is just a really quick example to show all the different things that have kind of emerged, or a sampling, I guess. And certainly we've seen over the last few decades that research on racial and ethnic socialization has grown and has included Latinx families, Asian American families, multiracial families, and indigenous families. And so this area of research is growing in really, I think, important ways. And so I want to just sort of make sure that I take time to acknowledge all of this work before talking about what we don't know about what goes on with white families. So when it comes to white families, often there's this assumption that only non-whites or people of color have race or are impacted by racism. And this really doesn't allow us to think about the ways that racism and whiteness and race in general shape the experiences and opportunities and outcomes of people who are racialized as white. We also know that it's really hard to get white people to talk honestly about race. And in fact, a lot of research shows that white people talk about race in ways that are elusive and contradictory. And so one of the things that I do in my study, which I'll talk about in a moment, is draw on ethnographic methods, which include observing people in their everyday lives, rather than just giving them a survey or something like that. And so, you know, and this again speaks to a larger question about if white adults are not talking about race, then what's going on with their white kids? Like, how are they developing ideas about race if the adults in their lives are not speaking openly about it? And then finally, another thing that I think is important to just sort of note is that a lot of research, again, is focused on parents. And I think that that's important. Again, I'm not trying to minimize that work, but again, I think it's really important that we center children in this work, in this research, and try to figure out what's going on with them by actually talking to them and hearing their voices and watching them as they interact with each other and as they notice patterns in the social world, et cetera. So before I get to the methods of this study, I want to note that I try to be really careful in my work to not center white families in a way that distracts from racial hierarchy, racial inequality, and racial oppression, which has certainly been and continues to sometimes be an issue in sociology, human development, psychology, and a number of fields. In other words, of course, there has been a lot of research with white families over time, but that research has historically treated white families as the norm to which other groups are to be measured and often found to be inferior. So I think it's really important to keep in mind as I proceed today, and to not lose sight of the long-standing efforts of scholars of color in carving out space in this academy or within the academy to research this topic critically. And so my advisor in graduate school, Amanda Lewis, she writes, "It is essential to place whiteness and racial privilege within the purview of social research and under the lens of critical examination. It is important to do so, though, not because it is hip, not because whites have been left out, but because doing so is a necessary step in confronting the continuing reality of racial inequality." So the two research questions that I explore in white kids that I'll briefly talk about today are, first, how do white affluent kids learn about race, racism, and inequality? So the process of learning. And then what are the racial views of these kids as told by them, which really is getting at the content of what they think. So for the sake of time today, I'm not going to spend a lot on this method section just because there's a lot that I could say. I'm happy to talk more about it during the Q&A if you're interested. I think that the key takeaway points, though, are that this study was a longitudinal child-centered ethnographic study. And what that meant was that I was really trying to access the everydayness of whiteness. So I moved to a community in the Midwest. I lived there for a number of years, but the period that I collected data in was January 2011 through December 2012. There are 30 families in this study. I observed them as they lived in their everyday lives. I also conducted interviews with the parents as well as the kids, as well as some informants in the community who were African American. And so I could kind of get a different perspective and make sure that what I was thinking was confirmed by them in their experiences. I also returned to interview a third of the families a few years later when the kids were in high school, which I can talk about later. So really quickly, in order to count as having class privilege in this study, I combined a bunch of measures that are often used in sociology. So the families in this, the parents in this study, one or both of them, most of the families were heterosexual couples who were married. They had one or usually both had an advanced degree. They worked a professional managerial career and they owned a home. And I used Zillow to try to figure out what the value of their homes were, which again, I can talk about more later. The kids were all in middle school for reasons that are developmentally appropriate, which again, I can talk about later. And this was, again, a city in the Midwest. It was a medium-sized city. Many people told me it was the best place to live. I think that was mainly white people that told me it was the best place to live. And certainly it took me a little bit of time to figure out what was going on. And I spent the first 3 months of my study trying to just figure those things out. And what I did was I identified 3 neighborhoods, and that's what I want to talk about next. So I have these images here. These images are not from the actual neighborhoods that I studied, but they are supposed to sort of depict what was going on here. So there's 3 different contexts that I'm going to talk about today. And so it's really important that you try to keep in mind the differences. So the first context is what I'm calling a colorblind context. And this is a community called Sheridan. Sheridan is almost exclusively white. And you can see from these images here, there were lots of big homes that were sort of in these subdivisions. This community identified as politically conservative. I was not interested in studying politics when I started this project, but it turned out that I had to. So because I found that these communities that I studied, or parts of this community that I studied, were politically segregated. So parents in Sheridan have chosen to raise their children in what is essentially a racially sequestered community. And I will show you, and I will go on to talk about what that means for the kids that are growing up here. The second context that I'll talk about is Wheaton Hills. And Wheaton Hills, I describe as a color conscious context. Wheaton Hills is a neighborhood within the city of Petersfield, and people here describe their politics as being middle of the road Democrats. There's a lot of private schooling that happened in this neighborhood, which I talk a lot about in the book, because the public schools in this city are sort of understood to be really good. So it's interesting to see why parents choose private schooling. And unlike the families in Sheridan, the first context that really embraced sort of colorblind ways of thinking, like race doesn't matter, race is not a thing anymore. Families in this community acknowledged that race matters, but they articulated primarily what sociologists Joyce Bell and Douglas Hartman describe as diversity discourse, or the work of Margaret Anderson on shallow multiculturalism. So they would be like happy to go to like a fair, a festival that celebrated different cultures around the world, but they were less interested in talking about racial violence or racial oppression or power or anything like that. Finally, the third context is Evergreen. And Evergreen is a context in which the parents really embrace or claim to embrace, I should say, anti-racism, and they are very invested in their public schools. They had an unapologetic progressive political identification, and this neighborhood was far more diverse than the other 2, particularly with respect to class. And so after I selected these neighborhoods, I recruited families that lived within them. And I want to share with you now some of the things that I heard from them. I'm going to skip past this because I'm keeping a close eye on the time today, and I want to make room for the kids' voices. But you can just quickly see, I observed them. I engaged in some child-centered research methods, which I can talk about later. I coded it. I can tell you about that later. Okay, so here are the findings. And these are only 5. There are, of course, many other things in the book. So the first finding, which may not be surprising, is that white kids see race. And as I mentioned earlier, developmental psychologists and sociologists have documented the silence of white parents when it comes to talking about race, and especially how race connects to power. And I found similar patterns. Many of the parents in Sheridan told me that their kids didn't even notice race. This is the quote at the top of this slide here. When I asked if I could interview their kids about race, some of the parents told me that they didn't think their kids would even know what race meant. But it only took me a few moments of spending time with these children to see that they had all kinds of ideas about race and questions and insecurities. And it was far more complicated than many of the parents thought. Many of the kids were concerned about being called racist. And that was an interesting thing to explore. And the kids also told me, and again, these are all children from that first colorblind suburban context. They told me that at their school, they were not even allowed to use the word racist. When I asked one child like what she would do if someone was doing something that she perceived as racist, she said, well, we don't have racism at my school, so that wouldn't even be a problem. And so literally these kids did not have the language to even talk about race, but they certainly had a lot of questions about it. So I have these 2 images up here. The one on the left is a picture of string cheese, obviously. And I'm just going to read a really quick moment from the book. So while eating string cheese one afternoon, Edward, who's growing up in this suburban Sheridan, the first one that I mentioned, the first context I mentioned, and his friend debate whether or not Black people have an extra muscle in their leg that allows them to be more successful athletes, jumping higher, running faster, being stronger, so forth. Edward is skeptical. His friend insists that there are anatomical differences between white athletes and Black athletes and points to the predominance of elite Black basketball players to prove his point. Edward peels his string cheese and dangles it above his mouth, and they're sort of thinking and talking about it. And without any direction from any adults, these two boys, I watched these two boys come to the determination that race is biological. The conclusion that these boys reach, of course, is not something that they've come to on their own. This is linked to a long history of scientific racism and these ideas that are clearly part of their social world in some capacity, even if their parents are not talking openly about race or at least saying that they're not talking about race. This second image is a container of bronzer makeup. And I have this depicted here because I also watched two white girls in this context talk about Rihanna and the musician and talk about what race Rihanna was. And they were kind of arguing back and forth. And the way that they decided they were going to figure out what race Rihanna was by using this bronzer that one of them had to rub on their really, really like white skin to see if they could get their white skin to look the same shade as what they perceived to be Rihanna's skin shade or skin color. And that way they could determine if Rihanna was a different race than them, or if Rihanna was white like them with bronzer. And what was really interesting to me, and I talk about in the book, is that these girls wanted Rihanna to be white like them with bronzer. And so the point is that whether or not parents are openly talking to their kids are growing up in a racialized society and are trying to figure out what race is, how it works. They're getting a lot of contradictory messages about it, and they're negotiating race on an everyday basis. And so certainly I am not the first person to say that white parents should probably talk to kids about race, although that comes with a lot of questions about like, well, what do they actually say? But I collect these headlines that always come about usually after a racist event. But you can see that there's all kinds of calls to parents to talk to their kids, to white parents to talk to their kids about racism. So I collect these, and I think that there's lots of reasons to think that it is important to talk to white children about race. But what I find in my research is that what parents say to their kids about race is far less important than what they actually do. And so another way to put that is that actions speak louder than words. So even though I think it's important for white parents to talk to their kids about race, what I find in this ethnographic sociological research is that what parents are doing specifically with respect to how they're setting up their children's social environments plays a much more powerful role in shaping how these kids are coming to develop ideas about race and negotiating race than simply what their parents are saying. And so what I argue is that all children are growing up in a racial context of childhood. And a racial context of childhood includes a lot of different things. And so I tried to identify in my research what were the choices that parents were making that structured their child's life in a particular way, that led kids to have certain interactions with certain groups of people or not, led them to observe certain patterns in their everyday environment, and so on. And so I talk about these choices as being bundled because I found that parents, they would make a choice about where to live, which was tied to their ideas about schools. And then that, of course, shaped the different kids that their own children would interact with in extracurricular spaces and so forth, what soccer teams they were on, the carpools that they participated in, who they were standing next to at the bus stop, who they played together with in, outside or like after school, in the summer after school. And so, in this sense, neighborhoods really served as proxies for a child's racial context, which is one of the points that I make in my work. And so overall, as I try to demonstrate through the data, kids learn about their own power and privilege through observing and interpreting the social environment around them. And so the decisions that parents make about where to live, where to send their kids to school, where to travel, what media to consume, what children's books to read or not, all of this contributes to how kids are learning about their own position within racial hierarchy. Before I give this example, I just want to say one last thing, maybe give some more context here. When parents move to a segregated white neighborhood because the kids in the integrated neighborhood are quote unquote too rough, or when the only people in a child's life are also white, with the exception of the economically marginalized Black and brown kids at the soup kitchen, who these white children are told they must save, or when their parents call the school repeatedly to get them second chances. When all of these things happen, kids are noticing and developing these understandings of their own position, but also the position of other people around them. And in many cases, I found that these kids are learning how to navigate privilege. So here's an example of Aaron. Aaron goes to a private school. I spend a lot of time talking with Aaron about what it means to him to go to a private school. Like, what do you think about going to a private school? Do you think it's fair? Like, do you think you get a better education? And he tells me that he does think that he gets a better education. He says, it's a better education. It makes me realize how special I am to have these opportunities. My school is not for everybody. And so what's interesting in this sort of here is that he is clearly receiving, Aaron is clearly receiving the message that kids at his school are smarter, more special, more being prepared to be future leaders, more confident, et cetera, than the kids that go to the public school. And in this community, the kids that go to the public school that's often a code for kids who are Black. It also is a code for kids who are white, but who have parents in different politics, et cetera. It's very complicated, but certainly he's looking around at his private school. He sees that all the other kids are white like him, and he's identifying kids like this as the kids who are really special. As Carolyn Tyson finds in her school-based research, racialized tracking processes, where people are put into these different tracks like AP or honors or whatever, that these processes, quote, influence students' perceptions of the link between race and achievement, their self-perceptions of ability, how they view one another, and where they think they and others belong. And so in this case, the whiteness of this gifted and talented private school that Aaron is attending reinforces racial stereotypes about achievement for the students themselves, right? So Aaron goes to this school and leaves the school thinking that he is better than and more special than other people. And when everyone else around him is white, those are perceptions that are applied more broadly. So while what these parents are, what Aaron's parents and the other parents in the study, what they say matters, so too do their actions with respect to the behavior in everyday matters. So it's not just about school choice, it's about locking the car doors when they drive through a certain neighborhood, a Black neighborhood specifically, which McDonald's drive-through to go through based on what part of town they're in, but also these decisions about where to live and where to send their kids to school. So as a result of all these different choices that parents are making, I find that kids have different ideas about race, racism, inequality, and privilege. And so these ideas largely, though not uniformly, mapped onto those three different contexts that I presented in the beginning. So within those three different neighborhoods, I found some patterns that led me to believe that it's a result of living in this particular social environment that is shaping how children develop ideas. It's not that parents are telling them what to think. It's that parents are sort of designing a childhood experience for them. Kids are then interacting with that. Kids have agency. Kids are interpreting things around them, and they come to develop very different ideas. So before I share with you the kids' voices, I just want to remind you all that these kids all live in the same community, or the same metropolitan area, I should say. And they're all the same age, and they're all white, and they all have similar access to similar kinds of resources. And so I think it's really interesting that their ideas are actually different from one another. So I'm going to start with Sheridan, that first suburban context. So I talked to Natalie, who's 11 years old, and Natalie tells me racism is not a problem anymore. Racism was a problem when all those slaves were around, and that like bus thing and the water fountain. I mean, everything was crazy back in the olden days, but now, I mean, since Martin Luther King and like Eleanor Roosevelt and how she went on the bus and she was African-American and sat on the white part, after the 1920s and all that, things changed. So there are lots of things that you can unpack in this quote from Natalie. I think the thing that was most interesting to me in the moment was that her mother was sitting right next to her as she said this, and her mother was encouraging her. She was like, yes, Natalie, like, tell Maggie what you know, tell her what you know. And it's possible that after I left, her mom intervened and talked through some of the misinformation that she was articulating, but I doubt that happened. And so I think that's an interesting moment to see this mom sort of not not correcting her, not stepping in. And certainly the ideas themselves are also interesting. Similarly, Ryan, who's 11 years old, also in Sheridan, he says, I think we have moved beyond racism, but like down on the Mexican and American border, I think it is wrong to let illegal immigrants come in without having a green card and steal our money. We work hard in America. They can't just come here and be lazy and take it. But for racism, yes, I think as a country, we have moved beyond it. So I'm going to transition now to the second context, which is Wheaton Hills, which is that, you know, the place was lots of private schooling options. It's where Aaron grew up, and it was where parents were invested in like, they understood that race was a thing, but they were really interested more in the culture, the diversity discourse. So as Robert says, I heard about this guy somewhere in the South who was burning one of the Muslim holy books because there's like people who don't like Muslims because of the terrorist attacks, and like they think everyone who is Muslim is a terrorist. So I also heard about people like white supremacist groups or something who don't like dark-skinned people. So what is interesting about what Robert is saying here is that he is identifying racism in American society, but he is understanding it as being connected to individual people. That there are individual racists out there, like the people that he mentions here, who are engaging in racist behavior, and that the solution should then subsequently be to, you know, get those people to stop acting that way. So Robert has some sense, certainly more sense about the you know, realities of racism in the United States in comparison to the two kids I just talked about, but he's really focused on the individual level. Similarly, Rachel and Emily, who are siblings, are also living in Wheaton Hills, and they have a discussion. So one of the things that's really cool about doing the kind of research that I do is you get to hear kids talking to each other, and that can be really telling. So I'm going to not go through their whole discussion, but they're arguing about whether or not racism still exists. And so Emily says, I think racism still happens, like the Ku Klux Klan and stuff, and they're talking. And then her sister interrupts her and says, no, Emily, I think there are some people who are racist. There are like individuals who are. And a lot of times I feel like those people who have like really strong opinions about stuff like that, they can end up being like really like smart, powerful people who make decisions. And I think it can still have an effect on the environment that they function in, because like, if they have strong opinions that they're trying to promote, then it can usually have an effect on other people. And Emily says, maybe. And so what I think is interesting about this sort of discussion is that Emily is really focused on the individual level racism like Robert, and Rachel is sort of seeing this connection between individual people having a much broader influence, particularly when they are in positions of power. So you can see that the kids are sort of trying to make sense of all of this. And I think that the kids in Wheaton Hills were a little bit further along sort of in a racial consciousness than the kids in Sheridan, but certainly they were not the same as the kids in Evergreen, which is this third context. So in the third context, kids told me things like the following. So this is from Connor, who's 11 years old. And he says, I think racism is a way bigger problem than people realize. It's nowhere near what it used to be. It's just different, and white people don't realize it. I think it's still there. It's just not as present, and people want to hide it because they are scared to talk about it. I also added this just to contrast with a previous statement from another kid. So he says, talking about immigration, he says, in Arizona, I know they passed a law that you have to carry around your photo ID or something. And police, they're always stopping Latinos because they don't believe that they're Americans. They believe that they're illegal immigrants, but really they're just picking on people that are a different race. I think it's really wrong and racist. So you can see here that Connor has a different perception of racism in America. Not only is he thinking about individual level racism, but he's also connecting this to policies. He's talking about this law here. He's talking about the police. He's talking about immigration. You know, he's talking about the government. He's thinking about racism as being more than just some random white supremacist dude, you know, in the South, which is what many of the kids in Wheaton Hills talked about. So my book has all kinds of other quotes from the kids, and I you know, if you're interested, you can check it out. But I want to move now on to the fourth finding, which is that the kids and children and parents do not always agree on these matters. And so while it's true that parents shape their kids' social environment, ultimately, as I've sort of been arguing, kids interpret this world for themselves. Children are obviously influenced by their parents, but they have agency and they develop their own understandings of how things work. So I thought that it would be useful for me just to read about an argument between a parent and a child, which is another thing that you observe a lot when you're doing the kind of research that I do. And this is from a moment where I'm sitting in a coffee shop with a mom and her daughter, Meredith. Her daughter is 12 years old. And so I asked Meredith if she can think of a time when she experienced racism or witnessed racism. And she says, I remember one time I was at a liquor store in Petersfield with her mother. And there were a bunch of Black guys in front of us, and only 2 out of the 3 or 4, I think, had an ID, but they were like obviously 45 years old. But the guy wouldn't let them buy the 1 bottle of liquor. So they were like, oh, fine, man. And then they left. And then my mom and I were there, and she was getting her a bottle of Merlot or whatever. And the cashier didn't even ask her for an ID. He was just like, okay, you're done. And we went outside, and I heard the Black men talking near their car about white trash and saying all this stuff about the white cashier. Her mom then interrupts her. She's continuing to talk, and her mom interrupts. She's sitting next to her at the coffee shop, and she says, but I think when you buy something at the liquor store, all the people that are in your party need to show. And then Meredith interrupts her mom in return angrily and says, those guys were not even standing near the register, and I was with you, and I'm not 21. Her mom rolls her eyes and replies in a condescending tone, okay, honey, if you say so. And this sets Meredith off emotionally. She gets mad. She grabs her cell phone and stomps off to the bathroom. She's gone for the next 10 minutes. Her mom goes on to tell me that this is just one of her most recent teenage antics and says, God only knows what I have in store for the future. With a look in her eye that seems to suggest that she believes we certainly agree on the matter of Meredith's story and trying to smooth things over, the mom says, of course the cashier wasn't being ridiculous. I mean, come on, how ridiculous? Or sorry, wasn't being racist. I mean, come on, how ridiculous. What's interesting is that later when her mom is not around to talk to Meredith, and Meredith insists that her version of the story is accurate. She says, it was racism. And sometimes my mom is racist and tries to pretend like she isn't. My mom just hates talking about that kind of stuff. So she confides this in me again when her mom is not present. So the reason I wanted to take the time to share that with you is I think it's a powerful moment, and there were others in the book as well, or in my research as well, where children are challenging their parents on racism, as well as parents, of course, calling their kids out for when their kids are saying or doing things that their parents perceive to be racist. So I think it's important to not just assume that kids are adopting the same ideas as their parents, which is a very common assumption that people make when it comes to this topic. Okay, and then my last final theme that I wanted to talk about today is that white families reproduce racial inequality. And so for the parents raising, this is from the colorblind context, for the parents raising children in a colorblind context, they contributed to the reproduction of racial inequality by not talking to their kids about race. Kids developed their own understandings of race, often with the help of each other. Kids picked up on how whiteness is normalized and privileged without even talking about it. And these parents also engaged in white flight and embraced extreme forms of residential and school segregation, which links to a long history of white parents securing resources for their own kids and demonizing kids and parents of color. These parents also did not provide their children with the tools to think or act critically in the world, or to even live in a diverse democracy. And I argue in the book that this perpetuates the racial status quo. But I also argue that the color-conscious parents are reproducing race and racism and racial inequality specifically. And I talk about this as a conundrum of privilege. Before I talk about the conundrum of privilege, though, I want to just remind us of some examples. So these parents often did things like using their social status in the community to advocate for their kids to have the best math teacher at the school. Or they use their exclusive social networks to get their teenagers coveted summer internships. They remove their children from explicitly racist and contentious situations as a way of protecting them, because, and they did that even while understanding that people of color cannot just remove themselves from a racist situation and carry on. And these parents sent their kids to exclusive summer camps, hired private tutors, while simultaneously arguing vehemently about the importance of equal educational opportunities for kids across the board. And so even though these parents told me that they knew they were giving their kids unfair advantages, and they even told me that they knew they were hoarding opportunities for their own children and children like their own. And even though they felt really guilty about this and told me about that a lot, they still made these choices. And so that's why I think this conception of the conundrum of privilege is useful, because the conundrum of privilege really gets at this tension that the parents in my book experience between being a good parent and being a good citizen. And I want to be clear that I don't think that these two things should be in tension or that they need to be in tension. But for many of the people that I studied, these things certainly were. And in fact, many of the parents wanted these things to align. But the thing that I heard over and over again is that, I care about social justice, but I don't want my kid to be a guinea pig. Of course, the decisions these affluent parents made about things like schools and neighborhoods or extracurricular activities are central to the intergenerational transfer of material advantages that reproduce inequality, and are deeply informed by ideologies of capitalism and competition and meritocracy that inform parenting. But I also think that there are some consequences, and this is really a key point. It's not just that these kids are going to become members of a professional elite class of workers and make lots of money and be successful. They're also learning. There's ideological consequences at play here too, and they're learning from their parents' choices about race in America. And so my point is that the choices that their parents are making not only reproduce inequality at the material level, but also at the ideological level. And therefore, these parents' choices play a key role in white racial socialization or white racial learning processes more broadly. And how kids are developing their sense of who they are is related to these decisions. So in terms of the implications of this work, I think that there are, theoretical, sort of academic implications, and then there are some applied implications. So just really quickly, in terms of from a theoretical perspective, I hope that my work can lead us in developing more sophisticated theories of white racial socialization or white racial learning. There's not a lot on this topic, as I mentioned earlier, so I hope that my work can at least get us moving in that direction. I also think that this work shows that while parents of children of color are teaching kids how to navigate racism, in many cases in my research, these white parents were teaching their kids how to navigate racial privilege. And so I think that's another area of research that hasn't really been complicated very much, is what is going on in white families? Like, what are they actually teaching? What are kids in white families actually learning about race and privilege? Again, I also think it's important to have research that's child-centered, and so I hope that my work can show the power of these longitudinal ethnographies with kids. And I also, of course, hope to demonstrate that racial learning is this interpretive process. It's not something that happens to kids, it's something that kids are participating within. And there's this bi-directional nature between parents and kids. Kids shape what the parents think, parents shape what the kids think, and so on. And then finally, I hope that this can contribute to the sociological understanding of how these ideas and ideologies that uphold these unequal systems are reproduced and reworked or even challenged by the newest generation. So these are sort of my theoretical academic implications that I think are important. But I'm really into the applied implications too, if I'm honest. Like, I really think that these questions are urgent and need to be, there's some real need to apply these findings. So I have 2 minutes left. I'm keeping my little stopwatch going. And I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, but just in brief, I think that there are lots of implications for parents and families. I've traveled around the country, as JT mentioned, and talked to a lot of families, particularly families of privilege, about sort of the choices they're making and how they might think differently and make different choices. I think this ties into a lot of ongoing discussions about anti-racist parenting that are this has really received a lot more attention in recent years, months. And really, I think that there's a need for us to all have different ideas about what it means to be a good parent. And so there's some other implications too, I think, for at the individual level of thinking about mental health and child well-being. But I also think that there's reasons to, there's implications for my work that have the potential to shape how we think about policies and the institutional drivers of inequality. If schools are allowed to cater to these affluent white parents, then that will continue to happen unless we change those policies and make it such that the parents can't call the school and make demands for their own kid, or that racialized tracking practices are disrupted, things like that. I also think it's important for us to understand that privileged kids are privileged in this moment. They have a lot of power as kids who have privilege, but they're also likely going to be leaders in the future, and I think that's really important to understand. Finally, my last comment here is just that I think that it's important for us to really apply this work to schools, especially because schools are something that we as sociologists or activists, I suppose, can actually intervene with in the way that we maybe can't with private family life. But I do think that there's an importance for doing responsible social emotional learning, teaching kids history, teaching kids what it actually means to live in a multiracial democracy. So in closing, I hope that today I gave you a sense of the process and content of white racial socialization practices, how I think that this connects to the reproduction of social inequality, both in the material level and the ideological level, and that I've at least briefly, and I'm happy to talk more, mentioned some of the theoretical and applied implications of my work. So with that, I am done. I went 19 seconds over, sorry. But I will stop sharing my screen and be happy to engage in discussion with you all.
Thank you, Dr. Hagerman, so much for that talk. It was just rich. It was really rich. One of the benefits of being the facilitator is I get to ask the first question, and like any good academic, I'm going to be a little long-winded in the build up to the question, so apologies in advance. And my question is really because I'm familiar with your work and including some of the directions that it's taking. And I'm interested in your comparisons of white kids, racial logics and consciousness across place, right? So I know that some of your more recent work is starting to get into comparing white kids in both Massachusetts and Mississippi, what many might consider to be two different worlds. And a good bit of our own discipline, sociology, seeks to describe and explain patterns in a way that generalizes our findings and research across regions, right? And this can have the effect of moving place to the background or minimizing or ignoring its theoretical significance. And yet Southern Studies does the exact opposite. It seeks to foreground place and highlight its theoretical importance to our understanding of social life. So, long-winded, my question here is, how are you thinking about place in your own research on white kids and the formation of their racial logics and racial consciousness?
Thank you so much for that question. It is like a really big one. And honestly, it's one that I have been thinking about for a long time because one of the first books I ever read was called, on this topic, was called Learning Race, Learning Place by Erin Winkler. And she's a Black Studies scholar at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And her argument is focused on literally like the place that kids grow up. And so her research is in Detroit, and she studies how African-American kids growing up in Detroit learn about what it means to be Black by living in that specific place. And when they leave that place, then they learn more about, race. It's like being in that place and then leaving that place that informs their racial logic. So her work has always influenced me. And I think some of my, this for white kids, I was in the Midwest, which was super interesting for lots of reasons. But now I'm here in Mississippi, and I have lots of questions. So yeah, so I'm some of my new work is looking at, my new book actually is looking at Mississippi versus Massachusetts. And it's interesting because in some ways the kids are saying very similar things. So it's like, I'm trying to work against this idea that like, oh, if kids are growing up in Mississippi, they're going to be super racist, and these kids in Massachusetts are going to be like super racially progressive. That's definitely not what I'm finding. I'm finding across the board, there's a range of perspectives. But I am finding that there are some contextual pieces that are really important. So for example, kids in Massachusetts have no idea about debates around the Confederate flag, around the debates around monuments, the Confederate generals and all that. Their understandings of like the racial violence in Charlottesville, they really were kind of like confused about that and didn't really, so like their points of references are different. What is also fascinating to me, and I can say a lot, so I'll like stop saying too much, but the last thing I'll say is that, this new study, I have some awesome graduate students from Mississippi State who've been helping me. And so I've been able to collect research across racial groups, so, kind of a bigger sample than I did for my previous work, which is my dissertation in graduate school. And so what I found is that a lot of the Black children in Mississippi at the time that we collected this data had never heard of Black Lives Matter. Like that wasn't something that they were familiar with. Whereas every single kid in Massachusetts knew this phrase. Maybe they didn't know much about what it meant, but they knew this phrase. They saw signs. There was just a different sort of I think, conversation happening in their local community about things that were going on. So yeah, so in this new book, that's one of the things I'm trying to explore is like what's similar, but then what's also different, and how does where you grow up really inform the way that you think about race.
Thank you. Just a reminder to all the attendees, if you can put your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box, that way I'll be able to kind of just look in one place for them. The first question we have is from Barbara Sears. Barbara's question is, what's different about education being taught in public and private schools when it comes to race? I think everyone is trying to ensure their race is acknowledged.
Yeah, so I want to be really clear that I can only speak to my data. So I can only speak to like what's going on with the people in my book. I can't make any big generalizations because I'm a qualitative researcher and that's not what I'm up to. I'm really trying to understand the deep thinking and how people are making sense of their world, et cetera. So I really can only speak to the community that I was studying in this book. And what's super interesting is that some of the private schools, there was a range of private schools that the kids attended in this particular community. And some of them had much more, I think, anti-racist curriculum. They were studying a real critical perspective on history. These kids could tell me all kinds of details about the history of racism that the kids at the public school could not. But the kids at the private school were all white. And so it's this interesting kind of like, so I was super interested in that, right? Like, okay, so they're learning more of these like facts about history, but they're not interacting with people who experience the world differently as a result of race. So I think there's some interesting, in terms of how kids are learning about race in these different environments, I think that's important in terms of the curriculum. But I also think that, at the public school, there was racialized tracking practices. There's racialized discipline practices. The white kids at the public school were seeing their Black friends get in trouble for things that they did all the time, like wearing a hoodie up on their head or whatever. So during school. So so I think that, and I want to be really clear that there are so many of my amazing colleagues who have spent all kinds of time inside schools studying these dynamics. And I'm not that person. I'm trying to study what goes on outside of school, but I would definitely send people in the direction of some school ethnographers. I have a whole bunch in my book that you can look at and really get into the details of this question. But thank you so much for that question. I think it's a good one.
The next question is from Heather Allen. Heather's question is, how did the families in the study respond to your book?
Yeah, thank you. I was very curious about that myself when the book came out. So most of the families have read, well, I don't know if you've actually read it. In fact, I gave it to one mom and she was like flipping through it to find where she was, which was not really the point, but for her, I guess that was it. But yeah, I was really interested in what they would say. And I think that for the adults that I talked to who have read the book or read some of my other work, they said that sometimes it's like having a mirror held up to you and you don't always love what you see in the mirror. But they all told me that it was accurate. And so as an ethnographer, that's the thing that I'm the most interested in is did I capture the perspectives of the people in the book, in the study? Did I actually capture them accurately? And so I've been told that I have, so that makes me feel really good. The one thing that I was a little bit sort of blindsided by were that some of the kids were reading the book in college. Like they were like in a sociology class in college and they're reading this book and they're like in the book, which is like totally bizarre. I had not really thought about that when I first did this. And so, I think for those kids, a couple of them texted me and were like, what is this? Like, why is the Atlantic writing an article that I'm in? Like, are you calling me racist in the Atlantic? Like this is a whole crazy. So I had a lot of conversations with the kids that I was still close with. I had coffee with one girl for like 3 hours and it's interesting. I had planned to go back and follow these kids like as they went to college and like after college, whatever. But I think being in this book has like shaped their racial socialization in a way. I don't know. So she was telling me, this one child, teenager, adult, I guess almost now, was telling me that, she thought she challenged herself to think differently after being in this book and thinking about herself in middle school. Last point is that middle school, like by the time this book came out, these parents were no longer thinking about or worrying about middle school dynamics. At the moment, they were very invested in this, but by the time the book came out, I think a lot of this was like in the past. So those are my thoughts about the reception of the book by the people that were in the book.
This next question is from Katerina Pasadomo Towns. Katerina asks, can you share a little about your conversations with individuals or families of color and how those conversations informed your analysis?
Yes, so I was so grateful that I was able to include these 10 informant, I call them informant interviews throughout. So, like I mentioned, a lot of people that I studied told me this was the best place to live. There's all kinds of those like reports that where they say, oh, this city is the best place to live. As it turns out, there's a lot of cities that claim that they're the best place to live. So I'm a little wary of some of those claims. But what was so interesting and important to me was that this place was not a great place to live if you were Black like that. And I would never have known that because I am white and my own whiteness shaped this research in really powerful ways, which I'm happy to talk about if somebody wants to ask me about it. But like, I wanted to make sure that I actually understood the racial dynamics of this city beyond just only the perspective of these affluent white people. And so the conversations I had specifically with Black adults who lived here, people who worked in schools, people who did like a lot of coaching, like worked with kids in some capacity. They had ideas about the community that really helped me ask the white parents different questions. So the great thing about doing a 2-year ethnography is as you're collecting data, you can then start to like follow leads and try to figure out like, okay, so they mentioned this fight that the school board is having, but like, what's up with that? I need to explore that and research that. And so I think that those informant interviews throughout the 2-year process helped me kind of ask the right questions and lead me in the directions that I might otherwise have missed because of my own perspective as a white person. And then also as somebody who wasn't from this community, didn't know the backstory. So those interviews were really important, and I'm very grateful for that, for the input of those folks.
This next question is from Kirsten Dellinger. Kirsten writes, to follow up on the issue of context, could you say more about how you came up with the neighborhood contexts, colorblind, conscious, and anti-racist?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So when I mentioned really quickly, because I know I was zooming through it, but which is not meant to be a pun, sorry. But when I was talking about methods, I talked about spending 3 months getting a lay of the land. So I did not intend to have these 3 neighborhoods when I set out. I just was like, I'm gonna go to this place, I'm gonna try to figure out what's going on and hopefully find some comparison groups. And in fact, initially I had wanted to compare white children growing up in this city with white children growing up in this suburb. And when I got there, none of the people in the suburb wanted to talk to me. I don't know why. I think I just didn't have the right connections. I wasn't doing my snowball. I just didn't have the right people helping me out. It was hard for me to form relationships with members of that community. And so I ended up I changed my study and I was like, all right, well, and then I realized I don't even need that suburb because there's so much going on within the city that is already complicated enough. And so one of the things that I was interested in were just like where white people lived in the city, like white affluent people. And it was really clear. I mean, the city is very segregated and there's like segregation is operating on obviously in terms of race, but also in terms of class, and then really in terms of politics, which was really interesting to me. Again, as I mentioned, I had no interest or intention of studying politics, but when I moved to this community, like literally the month I moved to this community, there was a massive political statewide debate that unfolded, fight that unfolded. And so people were very upfront about their politics and started putting up signs on their lawns and things like that. And so I couldn't ignore that. So what I realized is like, there are actually major differences in terms of where people are living in this city based on their politics, as well as, of course, living near other white people. So that's sort of how I developed those neighborhoods. I didn't go in with that idea. That emerged from the sort of like an inductive part of the analysis. So yeah.
And I see that the next question from Adam Gasso, Adam also wrote that he feels like he might have just answered what he was originally asking. So unless Adam messages me, I'm going to go to the next question because I don't want Adam to think that I'm ignoring his question. The next question is from Marcos Mendoza. Marcos asks, could you talk about some of the reasons for and against using the concept of privilege as opposed to alternative concepts like power, status, domination, or distinction?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Thank you. It's funny. You don't get a ton of control over your cover of your book. Although I have to say, I love NYU Press. I have nothing bad to say about them, but they were really intent on having privilege being read on the thing. And I remember being like, and they really wanted privilege in the title, which initially, choosing your title is not always something that you get to do yourself. I'm happy with my title. I'm not, again, I'm not trying to like say anything bad about NYU, but I was curious about that. My mom even said to me, like, why is that, why is privilege in red on, and so I thought a lot about that. And I think that since I wrote this book, there's been a lot more discussion, open discussion about privilege as a concept in terms of, sort of academically, but then also I think in the mainstream media, there's been a lot of focus on this concept of privilege. I was really trying to get at the sort of intersection of racial privilege and class privilege. And so I think privilege is a good word because I think those other words that you used are part of this, and I'm not like stuck to using the word privilege, but I was really trying to bring together the literature on class privilege, which often ignores, I think, whiteness, or at least it had when I was reading it, and this research on whiteness, critical whiteness studies, and kind of bringing that together. So yeah, but I wouldn't resist any of those other words. Those are all words that I think are connected and potentially could be more strategic. I think privilege often, like sometimes I've given a version of this talk to different audiences and people are very turned off by the word privilege. They shut down. So, I think there's reasons to think that maybe there's, strategic reasons to think that perhaps in talking to like public audiences that you might use different language. So I'd love to chat with you more about that if you're in person after the talk, but thank you for that question.
This next question is from Leah Tiesler. Leah writes, do you have any recommendations for books or resources for teachers to develop conversations about racism in their classrooms and to support diversity and diverse families in their classroom, especially for early childhood, so pre-K through third grade?
So that is a very specific question. I thank you for that question. I am all about resources and trying to connect people. So one resource that I love that I always try to mention is this website called Embrace Race. And Embrace Race includes webinars and lists of reading materials and things like that. They're sort of focused on parenting, but I think there's a lot to take away for teachers as well. I'm also a huge fan of the teaching tolerance. Oh man, I'm going to completely mess this up here. They've just changed their name from teaching tolerance to learning for racial justice. I think that's what it's learning for justice. I'm sorry if I'm messing that up. They just changed it, which I'm glad they did. But they have a lot of really great like curriculum standards and things like that can be beneficial to schools as they start to think about potentially having new ways to structure their curriculum. I really love some of their social emotional development stuff. I think that's really important, especially for the age that you mentioned. There's also, I think, there's some podcasts that are useful. Integrated Schools is a really awesome podcast. There's some amazing organizations that are doing work. There's one in St. Louis, actually, that I really love oh gosh, I'm totally blanking on the name of it right now. We Stories, where they're doing some really interesting work. So yes, there's lots of resources out there, lots of great reading lists, lots of academic books. I actually think that we're in a moment right now, there's just like a flood of resources. And sometimes it's hard to wade through them because you don't know if you're, some of them have different ideas about things. But yeah, whoever asked that question, if you want to email me, I'm happy to kind of think more specifically when I'm not on a Zoom call and try to look through my resources for you, because I really appreciate that question and the sort of motivation behind it. So thank you.
And I'm sorry if you hear my dog barking in the background. This next question is from Nicholas Sabo. Nicholas writes, these findings that you shared feel like they could have been about any time in the past 30 years, but have you found anything in particular about how the internet changes kids' understandings of race? There's a reputation of different social media for radicalizing kids in different directions. Did they talk about their online experiences?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's another one that I've thought a lot about. So for the kids that were in this particular study, they were between the ages of 10 to 12 or 13 when I first met them. And a lot of them were not using, maybe some of them had cell phones, but a lot of the cell phones were like the parents had set it up so it was just for calling, like they weren't using phones. And maybe that's changed now with that age group, but they were not really into the phones. They were really into video games. They were really into like other types of like watching TV and that kind of stuff. But the social media was not part of their life. Now, when I went back and re-interviewed them when they were in high school, it absolutely was. And in fact, I asked specifically this question because I was having the same thought. And I think that as kids get to early adolescence, that's when they start to have more encounters independent of they're on their own with their phone, doing whatever, or their computer. And what I found was that not only were kids getting most of their news media from sources that were surprising to me, but maybe that's just because I'm older than them, like Snapchat. Like I didn't realize Snapchat was a place to get news. Like I just said that I just never, like I know what Snapchat is, whatever, but I didn't realize that that was like a place to get news. They were getting a lot of news there. They were also using social media in the ways that I think are not unsurprising. There had been a horrific event, a murder of a Black child in this community by the police between the two times that I did the data collection. And so the kids talked about social media as a space where they were talking through a lot of their reactions to this and plans to sort of respond or not respond and what they thought about it all and debating it, lots of different perspectives for sure. But they definitely were using social media as a space to do that work. So I think that question is really good, I think, when thinking about like early adolescence, but I do think middle childhood is this tricky time where they're like, a lot of parents are trying to limit that, at least for the parents in this study, they were trying to limit kids, exposure to strangers via the internet. But yeah, some of my new work, I mean, TikTok, for example, and there's been some really interesting studies about white supremacist messages on TikTok. One of my colleagues has really, Cynthia Idris Miller, has been looking at like the radicalization of kids. So there's like a lot of other people that are doing work on this that are not me, but I do think that question is really, really important. And thank you for asking it. I think it's one we need to explore more.
This next question is from Barbara Phillips. Barbara writes, in thinking about institutions like public schools, how does your work inform what federal courts should have done if Brown versus Board of Education had also decided that segregation damaged the hearts and minds of white kids?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's like Nicole Hannah-Jones has been arguing a lot in her work. I mean, it's like, it's so obvious that segregation is bad. Like it's just so incredibly obvious that it's bad for everybody. Obviously it's bad for kids that are, that don't get the same resources, that are, kids that are disproportionately Black and brown that don't get the same resources as the white kids. But it's also bad for the white kids because it contributes to these ideas. Like it's not just, that's what I was trying to say at the end, like it's not just that they're getting more opportunities, better science equipment, whatever. They're also learning to think in a certain way that I find to be part of the problem, part of the reproduction of these ideologies that generation after generation reproduce the racial status quo. So yeah, that's my answer.
And it looks like Afton is saying we have time for one more question. So I'm going to take them in the order that I received them. This question is from Caitlin Hall. Caitlin writes, could you expand on why you chose children in this affluent environment as opposed to children who come from low-income families?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. A really good one, a really important one. Somebody needs to do a study that is looking at kids who are growing up, who are white, who are living in, economically marginalized families, working class families, even I think more middle class families than the ones in my study. I studied this population because I really wanted to find families where parents could, working from home, the hazards here, where parents really could make any choice that they wanted. I wanted to find families who were not constrained by, really anything in terms of making choices about where to live, where to send their kids to school. Like I had thought that these things might be important. I wanted to explore them in my ethnography. And so I wanted to find families where I could ask them like, okay, so given all of these different choices, like, why did you make the ones that you made? Like, why did you choose to send your kids specifically to this school as opposed to this other one, and what's going on with that? I also think it's really important for me to acknowledge my own positionality in my research. And so I'm a white person. I was able to access a lot of this research because of my own whiteness. I was able to enter communities. I walked into country clubs, with people, with the children that I was with. I did a lot of babysitting of the kids in the book, which was interesting. But I was able to walk into those spaces. Nobody questioned me. Nobody called the police on me. Nobody was worried about what I was up to, right? So I think that my own gender, my own race, really, I think it's really about my whiteness, shaped that. But so too did my own background growing up in a similar kind of family. So I grew up in a family that was, an affluent family, and so I think that I tried to use those positions as a way to enter into this community. I sort of understand, I think, some of the dynamics in this community, and I try to use that to my advantage and use my whiteness and my own experiences of class privilege to try to disrupt it, and to try to be, I can enter those spaces and do this kind of work. Not everybody can do that, but I know that I can, and so I want to do that, and hope that my work will contribute to a larger project of justice. So yeah.
I want to thank you, Dr. Hagerman. Just everything that you've shared is, there's so much importance in the work that you do. And I want to remind our audience, those who are zooming in, Dr. Hagerman's book is entitled White Kids Growing Up with Privilege in a Racially Divided America. It is through NYU Press. You can find it at any major book retailer. I believe you can even get it at Square Books here in town. And the book itself is, compared to lots and lots of other academic texts, it's an extremely affordable book. The paperback is still available for under $20. So I would encourage you all to go and get the book and read the book.
Wow, that was a good plug, James. Thank you both. Thank you, Dr. Hagerman. Thank you, JT, for great facilitation. It was wonderful to have you and to hear about your work. And thank you to the Mississippi Humanities Council once again, and the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at the University of Mississippi. And this talk will be available on our YouTube channel. Give us a couple of weeks to get it there, and you will be able to play it back. And I put Dr. Hagerman's email address in the chat. I will also make sure that you receive it in your follow-up email if you have any questions for her. Thank you again, Maggie.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming. I really wish I could see you in person, but thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for hosting me.